So, Anna, tell us a bit about your background and your route to your current role in Nyobolt as head of strategy.
So started out doing a degree in chemistry at university, and during that time, I did a year industrial placement with a company called Johnson Matthey, and so one of the areas that they look at is hydrogen fuel cells, and I did some work experience there looking at new catalysts for fuel cells. That got me pretty interested in how chemistry can contribute to moving away from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And so I ended up staying on, and I did a PhD in electrochemistry, still looking at fuel cells. And then following my PhD, I moved out to the US for a while. And there I was doing research in still in electrochemistry, but I switched my focus to battery materials.
Yeah.
So again, looking at how we can move away from fossil fuels using new technologies. Really enjoyed that. Got to work with some fantastic people, see a lot of what was going on. And then after kind of 4.5 years, moved back to the UK, and I moved out of the lab at that point. And I joined Innovate UK, which is the UK's innovation funding agency. And there I led quite a large program supporting UK companies in the design, development and manufacture of batteries, mostly for electric vehicles, but for other applications as well. So also there, got to really understand the UK ecosystem, some of the exciting tech that came through, that was coming through, being developed and can make a difference. And got the opportunity to, I suppose, move away from government and join industry. So I joined Nyobolt as head of strategy 2.5 years ago. It's been an interesting journey so far. I've been really lucky to be both hands-on in the lab and then kind of take that out of the lab and see how we kind of really apply the tech in different areas. So.
Awesome. And tell us a bit about your time at Nyobolt. How long have you been here? What does your role entail? And then after that, if you could tell us a bit about what Nyobolt does.
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Nyobolt just over 2.5 years now. So my role as head of strategy is quite broad, and over the time I've been at Nyobolt, the company's grown quite a bit. So when I joined, we were just over 20 people. Now we're over 100. So it's been a very exciting couple of years. But in terms of the areas that I cover, so sort of looking at the technology itself and how we develop that for different markets, understanding the landscape of different markets and where we can really provide an advantage and a benefit to both the end users and the consumers, and also operators. So we also work kind of in industrial areas as well. And then we've got the technology, we've got the customers, and then it's how do we deliver that? So the manufacturing scale-up side, the implementation. There's a lot of things to think about as you're sort of taking that technology on through to commercialization. So I'm really lucky that I get to play across those different areas.
Yeah, it's an exciting place to be at when a new technology is really hitting the mainstream in lots of other industries, not just the consumer market. And tell us a bit about Nyobolt. What's its USP, so to speak?
So we have a unique fast charging battery technology. So the company is a spin out from Cambridge University. It was founded in 2019, and it's initially founded following the discovery of a new anode material that's capable of charging or accepting very high charge rates. So that's typically the limiting factor in a battery when it comes to charging, is how quickly the anode can accept the lithium ions. And through research done by Professor Claire Gray at Cambridge University, found a new material that can accept that charge very, very quickly. So the batteries can charge just in a few minutes to completely full, and can keep doing that. So they don't suffer from degradation with that fast charge. It's a really exciting combination of that fast charge and long cycle life. So while maintaining a safe battery that still has enough range, enough capacity within it to do the job that you want.
And bring it to life. I've driven here in a Vauxhall Corsa E. I go to a fast charger, it maybe charges at 50 kilowatts or something like that, and it's charged 20 to 80%, maybe in 30. minutes or
Yeah.
so. What does a Nyobolt battery-equipped EV do in comparison to that?
So we wanted to kind of show the world this, so we actually built our own EV. And so the EV has a 35 kilowatt hour battery in it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to guess what the size of
50.
50,
It's not-
okay,
yeah.
yeah. So a 35 kilowatt hour battery in the Nyobolt EV.
Yeah.
With that, the vehicle can do around 150 miles.
Yeah.
So still pretty good range.
It looks better than my Corsa as well, by the way. Just we'll take a photo. But sorry, carry on.
And if you go and use, so this battery is capable of accepting what we call a 10C charge. So a C rate is the speed at which a battery can charge or discharge relative to the capacity of the battery. So 1C is if you were to fully charge the battery or fully discharge the battery in an hour. So we can do 10C. So that means we can fully charge the battery in 6 minutes. So
Yeah.
to do that, we need a 350 kilowatt charger, which are being installed today. So they are available in small numbers at the moment, but that is growing. So yeah, it's really unlike anything else out there at the moment. To be able to go from 0 to 100% in 6 minutes, that's, yeah, it's just, yeah,
Yeah, that's...
it's pretty exciting.
And I mean, just again, to bring that into perspective for learners, how many minutes does it take? You know, you might have the data for this, or we might just have to guess. How many minutes does it take for a usual combustion engine driver to pull up at a fuel station, fill up their car, pay at the cashier, and come back?
Yeah, so if you're going in to pay, then it does take... So I have timed this in the past, because I'm...
Yeah.
Because, you know, I wanted to be able to answer that question. I was giving a presentation, and the question
Yeah.
was, can we ever recharge as quickly as we can refuel?
Yeah.
And so going there, pay at pump, it's like 2.5 minutes. If you want a chocolate bar, it's going to be closer to 5 or 6. So, and you don't have to stand with the car while you're charging.
Yeah.
So you can plug it in, go grab a coffee. I mean, even doing that in 6 minutes can be a bit tight. I've
Yeah.
tried many times when I'm late for a train, but you know, it's so yeah, it's it completely changes the dynamic, and it means that
Yeah.
you know, it's no longer like, oh, I'm going to have to factor in like 30, 40, 50 minute stop on my way to wherever.
Yeah.
I'll just pop in, fill up, and get back on my way. It's
Yeah.
a different dynamic.
Yeah, I can completely imagine that. And I'll have to charge on the way back. And, you know, 30 minutes, it's a bit of a pain. Mm-hmm. You know, it genuinely is. 6 minutes would be considerably better. And I guess, yeah, that can bring us on to our sort of first focus, you know, onto how that changes the decision paradigm for a consumer. So let's sort of pull out a little bit. What are the biggest consumer demands for battery storage nowadays? We've talked about EVs, but what are the other consumer applications of battery storage?
So I think, I mean, I would say that EVs probably is the kind of the headline application. When we're looking at, when you're thinking about kind of the size of the batteries and the capacity of battery, where is it going? The EVs are a huge market and a growing market. I mean, obviously, you know, day to day, we're all walking around with lithium-ion batteries on us. You know, everyone, you know, most people have got their mobile phone. I'm sat here with my laptop. I've got my headphones that have a battery in. You know, it's they are everywhere. They're, you know, at home, household appliances, and then, you know, as we're looking to make that transition to net zero, it's also, you know, how do we move away from fossil fuels in a whole host of other applications. So other transport, so looking at, you know, rail, marine, aerospace is an interesting one because batteries, you know, for long haul flight, maths probably doesn't make sense, but you know, there's opportunities for hybridization, and batteries are still present in a hybrid drivetrain. So even if you have, so for example, a fuel cell or some other, you know, like some kind of combustion of a more green fuel than petrol, then you still have a battery in there, and so you need that. So EVs definitely dominate, but there's a whole host of other applications. And with the growth of renewables as well, there's the storage aspect too.
Yeah. And let's hit the probably $1 billion question, which I hear my parents grapple with, many people grapple with in the pub. Do I switch
Yep.
to an EV? Could you tell us about your take on the challenges a consumer faces when deciding to go EV or not, and what problems are left to be solved, or what problems Nyobolt's capabilities will bring that consumers will need to answer?
Yeah, so I think, if you have that conversation in a pub or a cafe or wherever, typically, the words that most frequently come up are like charging time, range, there's cost, and people are also concerned about, are batteries actually that good for the environment? So there's, those different aspects. People are used to driving combustion engine car with 400, 500 mile range, depending on how big the tank is. And then, as we've already talked about, you can refuel that pretty fast. But there's a lot of nervousness, I think, around kind of switching to something that has that smaller range, and combining that with the concerns around the charging infrastructure. So I think so there's statistics that show sort of around 40% of people wouldn't be able to charge at home. So if you can't plug in your car overnight and come out and it's fully charged and you're good to go, then that does present, some kind of more logistical considerations when charge points aren't as abundant as one might like. And if you've got to go and spend like half an hour to an hour sat at one waiting for your car to charge. So what we are doing and what the Nyobolt technology offers is a slightly different way of thinking about it, and that ability to recharge your vehicle pretty much as quickly as it takes to refuel. And then that means that use of public infrastructure becomes more straightforward, as it's growing, and there is still some, plenty of work to do in terms of the implementation of that infrastructure.
Yeah.
But it is improving. And if we are really going to move away from fossil fuel internal combustion engines over the next 10 years, then we need that infrastructure in place. And we need cars that can accept a fast charge and cycle through that infrastructure more quickly as well. Because if you've got a car sat on a public charging point for an hour, then there's a whole load of other cars waiting to then go and sit there for an hour. But if you can cycle through much more quickly, then you can service more cars per charger as well. So there's that aspect too.
That's a really interesting one. And what's sort of jumping out at me there are lots of trade-off decisions which are probably quite difficult to mentally compute.
Yeah.
Both for the consumer on, can I switch to an EV?
Yeah.
Where is the nearest station? What charging rates can I get there and at home? All these sort of trade-offs. But then also for, like you've just brought up there, a service station. Do we upgrade to a faster charging point because we can increase the throughput, or do we have more lower charging?
Yes.
Such fascinating sort of trade-offs. And just give us a feel for, your batteries charge at sort of 350 kilowatts if you turn it up to that sort of level. How developed is the infrastructure for those sort of ultra rapid charging points at the minute? How big is it planned to get? And are there any software tools that are helping you and others decide where to put that infrastructure?
So I think, 350 kilowatt chargers are being installed at the moment, but it's relatively new technology. So you're seeing them go in sort of in kind of supercharger stations, essentially. And whilst the numbers are set to increase, there's also challenges around installing that level of power and getting that distribution from the grid. So there's a lot of question marks over whether the grid can provide enough power for everyone to switch to EVs. And the generators, from a generation perspective, there's enough capacity and enough plan to cover that. The challenge comes with distribution and the time it takes to install the high power distribution and the cost to service these power charging stations. So whilst the infrastructure is improving, it's it can be costly and time consuming to bring in those connections.
Yeah. And, as our learners sort of have a look at some of these consumer applications where perhaps decision support tools for the on the fence, person who might be going to get an EV, which data sets or resources would you point them in the direction of to help them perhaps build software solutions to those sort of, difficult decisions?
So there's a couple of databases around that pull out all the charging infrastructure information. In terms of sort of some software and apps that are already available, a lot of people use, for example, ZapMap to look at charging points. And there are there's also quite a few databases with all the different EV models, their typical charge rates, battery sizes. So there's one that's evdatabase.org. I'll give you the link to it, but that's one I tend to go to quite often for stats on the usable battery capacity, what charge rates other vehicles can take. That's pretty interesting as well, seeing the growth in EV models as well that are available. So that's an interesting site to have a look at for some numbers and some stats on the cars that are available out there.
That's super useful.
But I think one of the things that you sort of notice though when you look at that is that the average battery size, we're sort of heading towards 70 kilowatt hours. There are quite a few models with batteries of over 100 kilowatt hours. But that's a huge amount of battery in the vehicle that's not really being used all that much of the time. Like the average journey, is under 20 miles a day, or average, driving. So if you're lugging around a massive battery that can do, 300 miles, how often are you actually using that? And then, where does it start to come in that actually having a bit of a smaller battery that you can charge quickly, what does that mean in terms of what you actually need to put in the car and the upfront cost of that battery? Because it's all connected. So there's obviously charge time, range, that upfront cost, all of it related to size. And up until recently, batteries have been limited by the charge that they can accept. So a small battery that can charge very quickly has not really been a possibility until now. So.
Fascinating. And one thing we talked about before, kicking off this interview was also about the environmental impact of creating batteries. And you've brought out a key point there, which is, if you can charge quicker, then for lots of people, they won't need such a big battery, which therefore has knock-on effects with the natural resources required to build them. Could you tell us a little bit about where you see that space going and how consumers are going to be able to make more environmentally conscious decisions on the EVs and batteries they buy?
So I'd say, in terms of the battery market and EV market and legislation around EVs, that is kind of maturing all the time. And in particular, there's regulations that have come into force and have kind of been phased in over the next few years around traceability of the materials going into the batteries. So batteries for vehicles are required to have a battery passport, which tracks everything from where the initial materials that are in the battery have come from, and all the way through to the battery's use in the vehicle. So this provides people then the ability to understand, how much work the battery's seen and under what kind of conditions, so the likely state of health. So this feeds in then to a whole host of opportunities, from tailoring the control systems that look after the batteries to improve the battery life, through to people, buying a second-hand car, able to sort of, assess, how much more can I do with this battery?
Yeah.
And that's a key part of the growing market that we're seeing is confidence in the second-hand market when it comes to batteries, and data helps people kind of make an assessment of that. So.
My final question on the consumer bit, and this is maybe slightly a wild one, or might be super naive. If you've got, let's say, a Nyobolt car or a Nyobolt battery-equipped car, and you usually do only 20 miles a day or whatever, and you rapidly charges, and you're very happy, and then suddenly you want to go on holiday to Scotland.
Yep.
Which of course at the minute would be really would take a lot of charging, maybe a bit of range anxiety, etc. Is there a world where there are modular battery packs? When you do that big holiday, you can rent a battery add-on that goes into the boot, plugs in, and gives you an extra 200 or 300 miles. So you get that nice sort of balance of longer range and rapid charging. Is that coming, or is that wildly infeasible?
So that is an interesting concept, and people are looking at that. I think in terms of sort of the battery within the vehicle itself, it's very highly integrated within the car, and there is scope to add. You could have a sort of standalone unit that you pop in the boot, but these batteries are pretty big. So I mean, you're looking at kind of hundreds of kilos of battery in a vehicle. So if you wanted to double it, then you're putting quite a big block in the boot, which you might also want to put some suitcases or something in. So there are I mean, it is something that would be interesting to look at. Is like what kind of additional range might you want to stick in the back?
Yeah.
And it is possible, and you can buy units to give you a bit of a boost, but it's that trade space between how big is useful before being a pain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like an EV battery is quite chunky.
Yes.
So.
It might have pretty significant handling consequence if you put a few 100 kilos in the back of that. Might be just wheeling the whole time. Anyway, we'll leave consumer battery stuff aside now. Obviously, a lot of your focus with Nyobolt has actually been retrofitting batteries for industrial use cases, which was something that just had never crossed my mind before because I'm just not in that industry. So can you paint a picture for learners, perhaps like me, who don't really know that much about how batteries are used in industry at the moment? Paint a picture of how batteries are currently used and how they could be used in the near future, what Nyobolt's vision is.
So I think one area that we see a lot of interest is materials handling. So that ranges from, I mean, the most typical use case you see is like distribution center, and you've got forklifts, or manufacturing, or any kind of industrial setting. You've got your forklifts going around, picking things up, dropping things off. Increasingly, so those typically have run on combustion engines, but there's a lot using lead acid batteries at the minute. But people are looking to move away from lead acid for kind of cost and environmental reasons, although to be honest, lead acid is pretty recyclable, but there's advantages from moving to the lithium ion in terms of the size of the battery that you need. So we're seeing sort of an increase in interest in lithium ion batteries in human operated forklift trucks. But another trend that we're seeing, and is going to, I think, only increase as the years go on, especially with the growth of these massive distribution centers and more automated systems, are the automated guided vehicles. So warehouse robots, essentially. So they can be used in logistics, also in manufacturing, delivering parts, picking things up, moving things around the factories. And these typically are operated by batteries. But there's some interesting choices and decisions that you can make if you sort of start to think about batteries a bit differently and being able to introduce fast charging into those scenarios, because throughout its route, an AGV will be stopping somewhere to pick something up, be stopping somewhere else to drop something off, and there are opportunities for it to get some charge quickly if the battery can accept it. The alternative is you have a battery that can let it run for the whole day and then it stops and charges overnight. But in these automated warehouse operations, there's a lot of 24/7 going on. So, that there's things running all day, all night. And if one of the robots has to take itself away and charge for several hours, then it's not doing the job that it was there to do. And so you need more robots to be able to cover that. So, yeah, there's some interesting, as we move to a more automated operation and that continuous use, then fast charging enables some interesting possibilities there. So
That's fascinating. You know, with my background being military, obviously one place that I felt this acutely was in electric drones.
yes, yep.
Which are very power hungry.
Yep.
Don't stay up very long and then take ages to
Yes.
recharge.
Yeah.
And are there any other sort of marquee uses like that where fast charging just completely changes the game that sort of spring to your mind?
So actually, I mean, you mentioned drones. That is an area as well that we've had a fair bit of interest, especially, you know, so it's like kind of trying to think of the word. I don't want to say surveillance, but that kind of thing.
Yeah.
where you essentially want a drone in the air all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
And, you know, there's other uses of drones in, say, agriculture, so monitoring the herds and also the crops. So having the drones go up. And there's also the last mile delivery aspect as well. So there's the kind of increase in interest in use of drones to be able to go and drop off the parcels in that last sort of few mile radius or whatever. So that's an interesting aspect. And again, you know, they have to come down and reload. So can they recharge while they're doing that? The alternative is people have like 3 or 4 other spare drones sat there ready to take its place because the batteries are recharging. So so there's that aspect. Any situation where you want something running for as much time as possible, you can either, there are 2 ways you can go. You either go for a massive battery that does the whole, you know, does as long as possible, or you can have a smaller battery that just recharges very quickly. So yeah, there's two scenarios, and it's a very interesting trade space to see, you know, when that distinction comes. And traditionally, there's been a lot more access to the larger batteries and not the possibility of this fast charge solution. So that's traditionally where people have kind of looked and how they electrify their application. But with the fast charging and the smaller battery, it's a different dynamic, and it's kind of understanding for a given application what makes sense in terms of the minimal, what's the minimum capacity that's usable, that's useful, that enables the job to be done, and then combine that with a fast charge, and the availability of power at that site is the other bit that you need. So
yeah, that's fascinating. So I mean, that kind of leads us on to the key question with this, which is, you know, how do you assess whether a company's application and their requirements are a good fit for your battery technology, and then, you know, use that to help, you know, convince them that it's the right or wrong choice for them?
Yeah, so for us, it's, I mean, you start with the use case and the duty cycle of the, sort of look at what people are currently doing. And then if we kind of replace that with our technology, what would that mean in terms of how that application is operated?
Yeah.
What are the trade-offs? So if you have a smaller battery, yes, there is a shorter range for whatever application, or, you know, shorter length of time that you can use it for. But if it can do the job and then recharge, then that enables the operator or the end user to save time, to reduce the number of vehicles or whatever within the fleet, then you know, it becomes very compelling, the case study, the use case for using the fast charge battery. So yeah, it's assessing, you know, what's the minimum capacity needed. Is fast charging available at the site? So some of the very large applications that we're looking at, if you're looking at like a 1, 2, 3 megawatt hour battery in a very large off-highway vehicle, then if you want to charge it quickly, you need like a 10 megawatt charger. So those aren't that easy to come by. So it's you know, so it's looking at, you know, what's the charge time that makes sense? Is the charge power available? What advantages does having a smaller battery and fast charging give the customer? And the other aspect, which I haven't touched on that much yet, is sort of alluded to at the beginning, but with the technology that we have, we don't get degradation in the battery when we fast charge, which is unlike typical lithium ion. It's a high stress situation when you charge quickly, but because these batteries have been optimized for that, you can charge very quickly without damaging the battery.
Yeah.
So we can get, depending on sort of the way the battery's configured, anything from kind of 2,000-3,000 cycles to 10, 15, 20,000 cycles. So that then again feeds into the business case and the operating cost for the end user. So there's a lot of trades. So are you willing to have a bit less range, a bit less energy in your battery for these other advantages? If you've got something that you just use for half an hour and then you don't need it again for the rest of the day, that probably doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But if you are looking at kind of a high use scenario, then there's a lot of potential advantages. So it's finding that balance.
And do you tend to have to do those calculations, I say manually, bespoke to each customer, or do you have a nice sort of decision aid tool that's available just yet?
So we do it kind of bespoke for each customer, but some of my colleagues are actually pretty good on software. We have got a very experienced software team here, and they have built kind of a battery sizing tool that looks at the characteristics of the battery, so the kind of the power, the energy, the response, the thermal response of the battery to different scenarios, and combine that with cycle life. So we are able to look at how one of our batteries would work across if a customer gives us a duty cycle, we can simulate how our battery would perform and what size battery we would need to put in to do that.
Okay, so it could be an interesting problem area for our learners to have a look at, this decision support area. You've got one tool which is looking at battery size, related to the customer's sort of use case, and then perhaps there might be other tools our learners could have a crack at.
Yeah, because that's very much looking at just the battery, but there's all the commercial considerations around the operation as well. So if, say for example, you wanted to look at how many charge points would you need in a factory to be able to do that? I mean, do you put them in the loading or unloading bays? How long would it recharge for? What kind of routes are these vehicles doing? What's the minimum? So we have got our battery sizing tool for when people know the duty cycle, but a lot of this is kind of new opportunities and people don't have that necessarily in place yet. So if you're thinking about a warehouse and you've got to run X robots over a day, how often do they need to stop? And how many, in different scenarios, how many robots could you get rid of if you can charge quickly, or what's the best battery size, that kind of thing. It's all a very interesting trade space that you can look at.
I love it. That's great. All right, let's move on to the sort of third and final core problem area, which I've actually stolen some of our own sandwiches on by bringing up the passport thing earlier. But let's just have a little chat about it, and if there's other interesting things that come up, then great. If not, we'll move on to the implementation stuff. But the third area for us to focus on is the natural resources required to manufacture batteries. Now, everyone would have seen in the news both the natural resource cost of creating batteries, and also like the demand for them, which is obviously large. Can you tell us about some of the key challenges and opportunities in the space, and how Nyobolt thinks about those? Yeah.
So I guess in terms of sort of a bit of scene setting, I mentioned the battery passport earlier in terms of tracing kind of the cradle to grave of the materials and what the battery does. So, kind of providing some insight or enable people to make decisions about how best to use a battery after, X years in a vehicle. Can it be used for something else, or is it better to be recycled?
Yeah.
This is all part of this EU regulation which has come in. And so the battery passport is being phased in over the next few years. But in the kind of nearer term, one of the requirements of that regulation is that people need to report the embedded carbon footprint within the battery. So that's kind of taking, data from, the materials being mined all the way through to being in the vehicle. And also for industrial use cases, especially kind of off-highway mining, people having to report their emissions. Looking at the kind of embedded carbon through the life of the battery is also very interesting. So, or it's something they have to do to be able to report out. So there's interesting. And there's choices that you can make as well around your supply chain, around logistics, how you produce these batteries. So from where you source different materials to where you process them to where you combine it all into a battery relative to where the battery is then used. So there's some interesting, and we're looking at this at the moment in terms of minimizing the carbon footprint within our battery.
Yeah.
And also understanding how that carbon footprint over time, over the in-use life of the battery, the advantages that we're also providing customers from kind of the long cycle life, the smaller battery, and trying to be mindful of where we're sourcing the materials and processing them. So, making decisions about where the different components come from, how we are powering the processing plants that we're using, the partners that we're working with on the different parts of the manufacturing. But I think, one of the things that we do kind of, it keeps coming back to for us is, what does having a smaller battery that can charge quickly and last a long time mean in terms of the natural resources? So as mentioned earlier about the kind of the trend towards larger packs so that people have range because they're worried about being able to charge. But if you remove that, what does that do to the overall outlook if instead of having like an average of a 70 kilowatt hour battery, if you have half that, if everyone has half that, what does it mean in terms of that use of resources?
Yeah. And on that as well, has anyone actually built the battery passport yet? Do we actually know what one looks like, or are they still under development? Because that could be a really interesting thing for our learners to think about what a battery passport might look like, almost as a USP, a selling point of a specific battery.
Yeah, so there are a few different consortia that have come up to try and actually start on this process.
Okay.
So it's an interesting situation because you need to have all of this data in there, locked in, but a lot of it is very sensitive data. So companies won't want the exact location of their supply chain, the precursors of the materials to be disclosed. In different parts of the value chain, people won't want, the design of the battery or, the bill of materials. That's all sort of highly sensitive information.
Yeah.
So kind of building that secure but uneditable database. It's an interesting interesting conundrum. So people are starting on it, but there's not one kind of readily available at the minute.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some learners might even want to build a prototype, what a battery passport might look like to the consumer.
Yeah.
Because that might actually be a selling point for the very environmentally conscious EV buyer who really does care about the embedded carbon and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think if people can see, where their batteries have come from and the advantage, based on how they're using the vehicle or, what they're saving in terms of the carbon compared to another source, then that, that people are very interested in that. And then, it's also that thought about where the battery goes next. So how can you assess the health of the battery and the suitability for another application? Or is it best at that point to recycle and reuse those materials for a new battery? At what point is there that efficiency trade as well?
Fascinating. All these things I'd never ever thought of before. Sort of a final question on that, on the sort of supply chain and things. How volatile is your supply chain to sort of world events and things? And do you have any software tools where you're monitoring the availability of different of your raw materials or similar at the moment, or is that not really an issue?
So the battery supply chain is a very interesting topic. So there's firstly, there's the kind of the supply and demand aspect of it. And if we're looking at kind of the growth in EV sales globally, and the expected demand for different materials, there's some interesting kind of data points out there on that. I mean, it's a hugely global industry, and then there's the geopolitical aspects as well. So quite a lot of the kind of processing of, in particular, cathode materials, and a lot of the graphite as well that's traditionally used in the anode. A lot of that happens in China, or in places controlled by China. Obviously, there's the interesting dynamic there at the moment in terms of the US looking very much to secure their own supply chains. So yeah, there's the geopolitical aspects. Then there's the more kind of, I suppose, the other events. So, for example, what we've been seeing in the Red Sea. So yeah, resilient supply chains, multi-sourcing, that's a very critical consideration. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, sort of the demand versus supply. So there's been a huge amount of analysis done looking at, is there enough nickel in the world to support EV batteries? Is there enough lithium? And there's a lot of assessments that say that there is sufficient, but bringing new sources online takes a long time, and doing it in a conscientious way is also, that's a consideration as well. So, yeah, kind of looking at options for different supply chains. And then, there's also the environmental impact of shipping all this stuff around the world and the timelines that takes. So there's a lot to be considered when you're looking at how you scale up and provide the materials for the vehicles. So I suppose something that ties into that as well, slight tangent, but is the increase in recycling technology from manufacturing scrap. So scrap that you produce. Anytime you build a battery, there's always some, material that doesn't make it into the battery. So at least in the near term, there's quite a bit of activity. As kind of waiting for end-of-life battery volumes to increase, people are looking at how they can really efficiently recycle that scrap material from the manufacturing process, because that improves yields as well. So.
Okay, I've got a final. We'll talk finally about sort of implementation and metrics really briefly, but I've actually got one more question to go really far back in the interview. Coming back to a point you made earlier, you said 40% of people don't have access to overnight charging. Are there any tools, software tools out there to help those people work out, therefore, how they would charge? Now, I know ZapMap tells you where the charging points are, but if you are someone who's on the fence about an EV, you might not be ready to do desk-based research on ZapMap of exactly where you're going to charge all the time. Like, has anyone built anything to help that 40% chunk of consumers make the switch?
Not that I've seen.
Okay. And
I think within that, it's also kind of helping people make decisions around, how big a battery do I need?
Yeah.
So, yeah, people can think about sort of the driving that they do 90% of the time. I mean, there's always going to want to be a provision for that longer trip, but if you can assume that the high-power charging infrastructure is there, and then, what do you need for the rest of that time? And then I suppose our kind of, when we're thinking about it, it's that interest in, if you can charge faster, what does it mean? Where do you need the charge points? How many? If you can get that throughput, then there's that aspect.
Okay, so final two questions. So, let's say an Inversity learner pitched you a new software prototype based on, the problems we've talked about today. What are the things they could say that would make you more confident about implementing it?
Yeah, well, the human aspect. If you're thinking about consumers, the human aspect is critical. So obviously here developing the technology, we end up, and most of us in the company are kind of from science and engineering backgrounds, and we're very much focused on the tech. But you need to think about, what does it really mean, and that human aspect. So it's considering, is it really realistic that someone's going to be okay with like a a battery that only has a 20-mile range.
Yeah.
Maybe they can do all their journeys, but if they're going to go to Scotland and they have to stop every 20 miles to charge, that's probably not going to happen. So yeah, it's sort of what, and I think that there's always going to be that kind of, if you're changing to a new way of doing anything really, then there's always that kind of hurdle. But what would give people the comfort to make that switch? And then sort of thinking about on the industrial side of it, ultimately people, are going to be most concerned, is making this change going to make my operation more efficient? Does it make commercial sense for me to do this, to make this adjustment, which is going to be any change in process or anything, that there's a period where you're going to be operating less efficiently. So, what is the upside? And does it make kind of commercial sense to do that?
Spot on. And then, finally, and this is kind of related, so you might just say we've already covered this. Let's say one of the learners built a tool, whether for consumers or for industry, and it was implemented. What metrics do you use to measure the success of a new product within Nyobolt?
I think, so if we're looking at kind of the success of a product, ultimately it's the commercial traction that we get with it.
Yeah.
So it's, but then that is directly related to either if it's a consumer application, what's the benefit that it brings the consumer, and are they willing to, there's a slight premium in terms of price for the high performance. Are they willing to pay that? And in an industrial setting, again, it's that adopting a new technology. There's always, whatever technology it is, there's always a risk associated with that, and a period where you'd be bringing that technology on board. So it's looking at, essentially, it's the traction on that front. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. And sorry, a final question on that. I said that was the final question. It's not. There's one more. Just like how much more expensive are we talking? For a Nyobolt battery of a certain size versus a off-the-shelf battery of a certain size. Like, what orders of magnitude difference are we talking?
So I'd say, kind of at the moment when we're lower volume, there's more of a price difference. As we increase volume, we can essentially access the same economies of scale as any battery technology. So we're essentially sort of pricing, the pricing is the same as a high performance battery essentially. So it's not necessarily the kind of low cost, high volume and EV technology that we're aiming at, but it's that high performance. So essentially, the batteries that you would see in like a high performance vehicle,
yeah,
I suppose. But because you're able to use a smaller battery because of that fast charging capability, then the upfront cost can actually be lower, rather than higher. And then if we're looking at industrial applications, then the increased cycle life and that improved efficiency means that the cost of the operation is actually lower than traditional technologies. So you can make significant savings over the operational phase as well. So and you could potentially use fewer devices. So it's there's a lot of opportunity for cost saving.
Yeah, it's really multi-sided, isn't it? Well, hey, thanks so much for that interview. It's been absolutely fascinating.